Having a ball. It's the Eric Metaxas Show, and we are having a ball because I get to talk to the chipper, ever sunny Ann Coulter. Ann, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be here again.
You're so darn chipper, and you really are. We're talking about this election, of course, and this is such a tough election for so many of us. It's been such a struggle. But you were talking in our last show about how people have practically deified Ronald Reagan, and of course, I admire him tremendously, but it is kind of a stunning thing. We act as though he was Jesus, and he didn't make a lot of mistakes. I mean, all we have to think about is the fact that his own wife was vocally pro-choice, pro-abortion. Yeah. After he died, she was, pro-stem cell research, using fetuses. She was bringing astrologers into the White House. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you'd make up, except that it actually happened. And then you think of George Bush, our last quote-unquote conservative president, and he did a terrible job of executing the war that he got us into.
Or of executing a speech. He couldn't talk like so many of these Republicans. No, I have a chapter on this in my book.
But the final thing that I just want to say is that the spending. He was a big government, a Mike Gerson, big government Republican.
Right.
And that's pretty bad.
I think the point is it not only are the memories of Reagan. You're right. It's getting a little idol worshiping at this point, often from people who were not Ronald Reagan supporters at the time, and because that was not the conventional establishment candidate. And in fact, all of the party leaders, I quote this in my book, Washington Post went back and talked to all the Republican leaders during that primary and saying, oh boy, it's going to be a Goldwater landslide if they run Reagan. No, all the official party leaders, just as they were all against Trump, were all against Ronald Reagan. And why is that? I think there's a reason for this. What was great about Reagan was he looked around and saw what the problems were. He wasn't trying to imitate President McKinley, which is what all of our Republican candidates have been doing for the past several presidential election cycles, and they don't remember what Reagan was. So what are their three big points in being like Reagan? Well, they all said it during the debates over and over again. I have optimism like Ronald Reagan. I have an optimistic... this is sounding delusional to people who are out of work, who've been suffering, whose schools have been overwhelmed with illegal immigrants. What are you so optimistic about, Mr. Pepe? And in fact, I go back and read, I told you I've watched it earlier this week, but I read that the one debate Reagan had with Carter and just pulled out 7 quotes at random. Look for the optimism in that. No, Reagan was only optimistic after he had been president for 8 years. He wasn't in the least bit optimistic when he was campaigning for Goldwater, or certainly when he was running against Jimmy Carter.
The one thing that Reagan has in common with Trump is that I get the impression, you can say whatever you like about Donald Trump, but I get the impression he loves America. Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. And I knew you were
going to say that because I think it's absolutely unmistakably true. But another thing is they neither of them are just fitting into some cookie cutter template of what they're supposed to do. Okay, so one is the goofy optimism that is utterly misplaced these days. That's supposed to be Reagan-esque. Number 2, this neurotic obsession with tax cutting. And by the way, I am totally for tax cutting. Taxes are what funds the government which oppresses us. So don't get me wrong here, but what does tax cutting do for people who don't have jobs? To be looking at the economic landscape in America now, where we've been dumping tens of millions of low-wage workers on the country, and we have so many low-skilled people, and it's moving into the middle-class kids. Americans simply out of work. No, a tax cut is not going to help them.
Okay, now let me ask you.
He doesn't obsess over it.
But wouldn't people say that a tax cut would create jobs as it did under Reagan and Kennedy? I mean, when you cut taxes...
Of course, but Trump does have a tax cut. He acts like that's the be-all, end-all. That is all we need to do. And every other one of these Republicans running for president this year, they didn't say, let's renegotiate NAFTA. They didn't say we're not going to pass Trans-Pacific Partnership. They didn't say we're going to build a wall and stop dumping low-wage workers on the country. No, they have one answer. What did Reagan say? Well, that was a different time.
Right.
Taxes have gone down the top
Right.
tax rate under Reagan was 90%.
90.
It hasn't been anywhere close to that since Reagan was president. And the third thing is this, and they actually say it when they're talking to you, this weird fixation on attacking Russia. No, this is not honoring Reagan's legacy. As I say in the book, it is denying it. Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. The evil empire is no more.
Right.
These conservatives, they're like the gays. It's not enough to beat the Soviet Union. We can't just beat the Russians. Now we have to humiliate them.
It's interesting you say that because, I mean, of course we have legitimate concerns with Putin with regard to religious liberty in Russia. There's all kinds of stuff. But to demonize Russia as though it were being led by Joseph Stalin really is strange. I agree with that.
These liberals and the Reagan imitators, the ones who run for president by having, Ronald Reagan fantasy camp, they sound like crazier than the old Birchers. I'm expecting them to start worrying about fluoridation in the water, which, by the way, is not healthy.
Okay. Now, let me ask you another thing. I was saying earlier that Trump clearly loves America, right? And so you really do get the impression, and I think this has to matter to everybody, that he doesn't care about being president. He cares about America.
Yes.
Whereas Hillary Clinton, I genuinely believe she doesn't care about America. I believe that the one thing that makes her get out of bed in the morning is that she has got to become president, or everything she has put up with, which is to say defending her awful husband and his philandering for 40 years, all of that means nothing unless she can parlay it into being the first woman president.
I think that is true, and I think it's also true, something almost worse than that. Trump loves Americans, as you will also read in my book, the story about Anna Lee Hill, the family farm he saved 30 years ago when he could not possibly have been thinking about running for president. He's saving a family farm and saying we send billions of dollars to foreigners, but we don't care about our own farmers. He has always said, I get along with the taxi drivers, the workers. He grew up on construction sites. He likes Americans. Hillary does not like Americans, and I think she's running she'll be patriotic just as soon as America isn't America anymore. She wants to get rid of those deplorables. No, we will put them down. We will insult them. We will make them attend white privilege classes, and it will be all-out war on white heterosexual males. She dislikes Americans and wants to replace them with foreigners.
What I can't understand is how so many people who are not, let's say they're not particularly pro-Hillary, but that they refuse to vote for Trump. What I have yet to hear from somebody, and I think you were saying this earlier, is somebody can explain to me how we could survive 4 years of Hillary Clinton. They act as though it's 4 years of Walter Mondale,
right.
Or this is
or
not
that
1980.
It's not 2016.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's another. We're in another time. We already have, a Supreme Court that is basically usurping democracy as we know it. I mean, they're judicial liberal activists who don't understand the Constitution. Once you have that, you have to understand that you're in trouble. This is the last exit before the toll. But people don't seem to believe that. They seem to think everything will be fine. No,
it's very strange, and I've noticed this among some talk radio hosts and one allegedly conservative news network. They all just, walk around saying, if Hillary's elected, we do better. No, you don't. No, you don't. When there's no hope, people stop paying attention. I'm
right.
calling you from L.A. right now. How much attention do you think people care about local politics? When not only can Republicans never win, but the Democratic Party as we think of it can never win. It's the Hispanic Democrats against the Asian Democrats, and soon it's going to be the Muslim Democrats. As the president of Singapore said years ago, you can't have democracy in a multicultural society because ethnic groups just vote their ethnic group. They don't vote their social interest. They don't vote. And we are seeing it here in California. There will be absolutely no point to what you and I do. Well, I guess your radio station is going to become, all Christian broadcasting. But it is over.
Yeah.
There is no point in arguing about anything.
Right.
No, it's over with this election. I'm amazed we still have hope in America, but the only hope lies with this reality TV star with his gold belt buckle.
That's exactly right. I have said that, not in those words. Folks, I'm talking to Ann Coulter. Stick around. More great stuff when we come back. MetaxasTalk.com. Hey, folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. I'm talking to Ann Coulter. Ann, you just, before we went to the break, you made this point about how people check out, like when everything goes to heck. People don't vote anymore. And I actually make that point in my book, that's the only thing that makes democracy work is people believing we really are the people. We really are the government, and we will be engaged, because if we're not engaged, it all falls apart. And when you have people voting along ethnic lines, like you just said is happening in L.A., that's the end of democracy. I mean, whatever it is, you may have people voting, but it's no longer democracy.
Right.
And
right.
they don't love their country. I mean, my parents came to this country. They loved this country. They said, this is, we feel privileged to become part of the melting pot. And the fact that that the Democratic Party is now really, it's the whole victimology, but it's telling people, no, don't let go of that ethnic group. That's all you've got. You're more Mexican than American. And there's something so wrong-headed about that, but that's kind of where we are.
No, that's right, and I mean, America, it's an amazing country, the greatest country that's ever existed, and again, the last Christian country on earth. We can assimilate all kinds of people, but not at the rate we've been taking them in, not when it's from such divergence, such different cultures. I mean, nothing like the pre-1970 immigrants. But even those, I have confidence over time we could assimilate, but not when it's a hate crime to try to assimilate people to American culture. Not when from grade, kindergarten through college, American students are taught that their culture is the worst, the most corrupt, that we have oppressed the other peoples of the world, and you are engaging in white privilege, and you owe these hordes we are bringing in from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Guatemala, and so on and so forth. I start my book with this, that people, I mean, it's kind of a surprising thing that I think it's an unusual statement for most people to hear. We are not only is America our home, and most people are attached to their homes, even if they're really crappy homes. People get homesick. They like to show you around their hometowns, and no matter how dilapidated or stultifyingly boring it was, people always say, good place to grow up, this is my home. We have subjectively a reason to defend America because it's our home, but objectively, it is the culture that gleams the best, that works the best, that is the fairest to especially women and children, something you do not see in the rest of the world. Right. That's going to be gone if we don't stop this business of replacing ourselves with other cultures.
Well, and it is important that you say other cultures, because people do misunderstand when they accuse you or me or anyone of being xenophobic. The point is, if you're a Christian, you know that we're all sinners, we're all equal, 100% equal. But when you're talking about cultures, there are cultures that oppress women. In India, before Wilberforce and the Christian missionaries got in there, they were burning women alive with their dead husbands. When a woman lost her husband on his funeral pyre, they would practice sati, the great tradition of burning the wife, the widow, alive. Christianity stopped that. Now, how can you say that one way of seeing things is not superior to the other? But we live in a day and age where we're so afraid to say that, as though we're putting the people down. We're not putting the people down. We're putting the abominable practice down. We're putting the culture down. When you were saying that, when you talked about Mexican rapists, you weren't saying that Mexicans are rapists. You're talking about a culture. I mean, the fact that we can't have that conversation, it dismays me, basically.
Well, 2 points on that. There have been enormous studies on cultures and which ones work and which ones don't work. And the two most prominent factors, I mean, this is mostly out of Harvard, and there's a guy at UCLA, and they have conferences on it. You wouldn't know it. It's so buried by any place you might read about it. But there's one book, Culture Matters, edited by Samuel Huntington at Harvard. The two main factors for successful cultures are, curiously enough, you reminded me of it with the Indian Sati story, years of British rule and Protestantism.
Yeah.
And we won't get into that for the moment. Just interesting facts. The third one seemed to be, there were 3 in all, and the third one was kind of an extension of the first 2. But as for the sati practice, that was ended when the British commander on site, the sati practitioners in India, came to him and said what we hear and bow down to every day in this country now, and said, well, you just have to understand this is part of our culture. We believe the widow has to die with her husband. This is our culture. You have to understand us. And the British, I forget his name, British commander said, yes, no, I understand that's your culture. Now let me tell you something about our culture. While you're building the funeral pyre, we will be building a gallows. And the first person who lays a finger on the widow and throws her in the fire will be hung from the gallows. That's our culture.
That's right. Well, again, the problem here is that for the last 40 or so years, we've stopped teaching that there's such an idea as objective truth. We act as though everybody's truth is equal. That is simply not true. If that's true, then there's no problem with burning Jews and killing Jews. There's no problem with genocide and slavery. It's just your point of view. It's not just our point of view. These things are objective truths. We're going to be back with one final segment with Ann Coulter. Folks, stick around. It's metaxastalk.com. Please go there. If you go there before midnight tonight, you get a free pack of unfiltered cigarettes. Check it out. Hey, folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. Final segment with Ann Coulter. Ann, I understand you have a book out.
Why, yes, I do.
Do you? Does it have a title of any kind?
In Trump we trust, e pluribus awesome.
I actually laugh every time you say that. I love that. E pluribus awesome. I think I find it funny just because you're not really like that. Like you're doing it with a wink. You're not a Valley girl who says awesome. So it makes it all the more funny coming out of your mouth. But you have been from the beginning, mocked for supporting Trump. And of course, now he is our candidate. And you seem to see in him something you didn't see in the other candidates. There were a lot of great men running, but somehow in this election, you saw that they weren't up to whatever needed doing. What are some of those things that you saw in Trump that you seem to think he can do that, let's say Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz was not up to, or Marco Rubio?
Well, it is the issues, but on top of that, in a way, and I describe this in the book, in Trump We Trust, at first I kept thinking, oh, finally, he's saying everything that we need said. If only he were a more elegant person. Why couldn't Romney be the one saying all this? But as I describe in my book, as soon as the thought enters your head, you realize that is a creature that does not exist in nature.
Yeah.
You have to be a vulgarian to go against the elite opinion like this. He just looks around the country, sees what the problems are, and says, illegals are streaming across our southern border. Let's build a wall.
Yeah.
And then look at all hell breaks loose when he says that. Simple, common sense solutions. I think the other candidates, in a nutshell, this is how I describe it in my book, the other candidates, though they did have very impressive resumes, they decided, okay, at this stage, I've been governor, I've been a senator, I'm very popular, I went to Harvard. Actually, that's a different guy, the popular one and the Harvard guy. Very unpopular, Mr. Harvard.
Right.
And decide, well, I want to be president. So what issues do I come up with? Well, I'll hire campaign consultants, I'll hire pollsters, I'll hire speechwriters, and they'll tell me what to run on. With Trump, it's exactly the opposite. He figures out what the important issues are by looking around. And he sees what all of us see, that the country is really suffering. It is falling apart, and if we don't act now, it's going to be too late.
Yeah.
The rest of them go to the consultants and say, tell me what to say to get there. He says what needs to be done, and that's why I think he's going to get there.
Well, it's interesting because when I was watching those first debates, the one thing that I noticed was that he had a kind of fire in the belly that they lacked, and that's been torturous over the years to have candidates who don't have the anger at the injustice or at whatever is wrong. They sort of act like everything's fine, and that's what I think makes them now say, well, I guess if Hillary has to be elected, I can live with that. It's almost like Michael Dukakis responding to, if Kitty had been raped. They kind of act like, well, let me let me think about that. And you think, wait a second, did you just hear the words that were spoken? Are you not upset? You're not upset that America is going down the tubes forever? Like you don't seem to understand that. And they actually, many of them, I think, were acting as though this were an election just like any other.
Yeah.
And that's not all of them, but definitely many of them.
Yes, that's a fantastic comparison. That was one of the most hilarious exchanges ever. And as with Hillary's basket of deplorables and Americans who are irredeemable, but thankfully they're not Americans. The elites didn't even understand what was weird about Dukakis's answer.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like they would say, well, I don't know. I think that you have to look at it from the rapist's point of view.
Right.
And maybe he was beaten as a child, and who are we to judge? So when somebody doesn't have that kind of visceral reaction, you think, what kind of a man is that? What kind of a person is that? And I think that in this election, part of what has been compelling about Trump is that he seems to have a proper kind of anger at the insanity. I mean, I have to say, one thing that he has talked about with great passion is the atrocities committed by ISIS. And he has even been specific about, and I thought, everybody in America should be talking about this. Everybody in America, at another time, we would all be putting on uniforms to go over to defeat them because we would say, this cannot stand. This is evil.
Well, also, I would particularly add that he's the only one with a common sense solution. And I think, you'd ask people in the 1950s, okay, they're chopping off heads in the Middle East. Should we bring them in as immigrants? Would this be a good idea to bring them here and make them citizens? Or do we want to send ground troops? Or are we going to solve this problem by remaking the Middle East into lots of little Jeffersonian democracies? Which one seems easier? Moratorium on immigration, Muslim immigration in particular we're going to look at. Or should it be America's responsibility to undertake and turn Syria into Vermont? Good luck with that.
Yeah.
That was Marco Rubio's solution. Oh, well, sneering at Trump for his Muslim, that was all of their solutions.
Yeah.
And they go through this in the book. No, and Rubio's solution is something very simple. We'll just invade all these countries, start a war with Russia for fun, but just keep letting the Muslims pour in at breakneck speed. And by the way, post 9/11, I have a chapter that begins, Muslims must have thought they were going to be so hated after 9/11. But no, instead we're cutting them hundreds of thousands of dollars to build mosques throughout the Middle East. We almost built a mosque at at the site of Ground Zero. We have been letting in more Muslims at a faster pace since 9/11 than we did before 9/11. We let in more immigrants from Muslim countries than we do from Great Britain.
Well,
does that seem like a good idea,
it's a kind
America?
of
because that's your choice this election.
It's kind of like it has its equivalence in the idea of white guilt. In other words, we're so. It's why Merkel said, let's bring in 1 million Muslims, because they're still guilty from the Third Reich. I mean, they should be guilty, but this is not the solution. We're out of time. Anne, thank you again for being on the program. Always a joy to talk to you.
I'll be back in 2 weeks. Talk to you in studio.
Fantastic. Folks, that's it. We'll be back for one final segment. Anne has to leave.